Hi, my name is Sander Drecht and welcome to a new Fusion tutorial for ActionVFX.com. Today I'm going to show you how to go from a shot like this to a shot like this. Isn't it cool? Lots of things blowing up, and it's all made possible thanks to the incredible VFX collection from ActionVFX.com. Now this tutorial is quite similar to the one Landon Bracewell did for After Effects, but it's for Fusion. I'm not going to recreate the shot from scratch, but I'm going to go through the end result that I created and show you what I did, how I did it, and sometimes tell you a bit about why I did it. So without further ado, let's get started. I started out with the shot you see here. It's shot in some form of log. I'm not sure what log form it was, so what I did was use the generic Cineon log tool that's inside of Fusion to see what values there are in the logarithmic scale. It starts out about 30, it goes about here into 768, so I went here and changed it to 30 and 800 and used conversion gamma to go to a 2.2 gamma. Now, ideally you would do compositing like this in a purely linear fashion, but since I suspect lots of people who will be watching this aren't quite up to speed as to working with linear, I'm going to go with the standard sRGB 2.2 gamma work, and we'll save the linear stuff for a later date. Suffice it to say that I start out with a nice shot like this, and in the end I change it back with a reversed log with the same settings, and then use a file LUT to change it in something a little bit cooler looking. So you go from this to this slightly more contrasty golden hour look that I kind of like. While compositing, I take a look at the file LUT from time to time to see if everything we composite together matches up with the way we want it to look. Anyway, since it's a moving shot, one of the first things you do is track the shot so we can put all the elements inside of it. I will show you what I did in a separate composition. I had the shot selected from the beginning, and then I decided where the impact would be, more or less. So I thought, well, okay, at frame 30 is a good time to start. Then I used a planar tracker instead of a full 3D tracker because I feel in a shot like this, with not too much movement, it's not necessary to do complete 3D track. So what I did here was set the reference time to 30 because that's where I start. I imagine that the explosion will be right about here. So I make a selection that's more or less flat. I exclude the railroad beams as much as possible. And then I just set this part to translation, rotation and scale, because if you use either perspective or affine, it will distort the elements that you put on top of the image. And since I don't want that, I just go for the translation, rotation, scale, because that will keep everything nicely locked down. So I start the tracking, and I keep an eye on when the tracker loses track, which is when all the red thingies start appearing. So what I do is I stop at a certain point and I go like, okay, at frame 70 I'm almost losing my track. I move over the selection polyline to this point and I continue the track from here all the way to the end. Then I create a planar transform tool because I have a thingy called boom here. I use the planar transform tool like this. I position the explosion placeholder where I think that the explosion will be in the end. Oh well, we're using ActionVFX, so it's a big explosion. Like so. And then the planar transform tool will stick the explosion to the frame. That kind of looks excellent. So I did the same thing with the actual shot. I used the planar tracker to create a planar transform all the way over here. And then I used an empty image with the same resolution as original footage as a pre-comp layer where I put all the other stuff on top of so that they all move together when I put it on top of each other. So it's time to see what I did and what I started out with. I used a very nice looking explosion from the ActionVFX Explosions 2 collection. I set the speed at 3 times because it was shot at a nice slow-mo pace and I wanted it to be a little bit quicker. You can still see a little bit of the ground in the original footage, so I use a matte control to get rid of that part. I use my own special After Effects style tint that I created to more or less match the functionality of the After Effects style After Effects tint. I will make this available shortly so you can follow along, but it is possible to achieve the same things with color correctors or curves or whatever, but I find this to be very intuitive, and Fusion didn't have that tool natively, so I created it myself. What I like to do is use the merges that go on top of the pre-comp layer in a neutral setting, 0.5, 0.5, so it's centered on top of the background, the pre-comp layer, so to speak. But since it's a very large image, I use the transform tool in front of it to reposition the image so it ends up here. That's a nice explosion, but there's no way this is realistic, so we need extra stuff in there. Luckily, ActionVFX has a lot of stuff to put in there. So what we're using is ground bursts, some cool concrete debris, a few dust elements, and of course some cool extra fusion tricks to blend it all together. So the first thing that I realized I needed was extra debris from the ground, because if an explosion like this happens, it will blow up the ground as well. So I got the cool ground bursts from ActionVFX, of course. There was something special about those, because since the explosion needs to be both in front of the debris and behind it, I used it 2 times. The cool thing is that the ground bursts from ActionVFX use EXRs that come with various mats included. So in this case it has an ID out green, ID out blue, and ground ID out green. I have no idea what that means, but effectively it means that there's a part for the ground, for the small thingies, and for the separate parts, and of course a little bit for the shadow as well. Since they are in the various color channels, we can use them inside the Fusion to mask out the footage. So the end result is that I have this explosion like that. Then I put the explosion on top of it. I didn't want to put the ground on top of the explosion again, so I use these masks to only put in front of it the stuff that I need. So that's the cool thing of using these tools, the bitmap tools in Fusion. You can use the color channels to mask out some stuff. It looks pretty cool. And if I put it through the file LUT, it still looks pretty cool. Pretty convincing in itself, but it definitely needs some more work. So that's what I did. I put in some more work to make it look even better, because the ground bursts really do look cool, but they are a bit big in itself, and it needs a little more detail because it's a dirty piece of a railroad track where the explosion happens, so we need a little bit more of small debris. Luckily, ActionVFX also has that in its collection. So I looked for this part, the concrete debris angled 5 beauty 2K, bam, and it looks kinda cool. This debris also comes with a shadow pass that I darkened and put together. It's subtle, but it's there. You go from this to this, and then you put it on top of the other footage, like so. I use the tint to make it match better with the original footage, like this. And it looked better already, but we weren't finished yet. It was time to give the explosion a little more oomph, so to speak. So I used a similar method to the one that Landon did in his tutorial. I branched off the explosion, I moved it up a little bit, and then I color corrected it with the tint tool, used the levels function of the color corrector to make it a little more intense. Then I blurred the heck out of it and put it on top of the footage. I like saying footage. And when put to the violet, it looks pretty good, pretty intense. And the red from the explosion blends in with the red that I added from the glow. I put in even more glow, like this, because that way you light up the environment a little as well. So the basic steps are the same. Use a color corrector. I made it a little more red than the original one. I made it a little more intense. And I blurred the heck out of it as well. And then put it on top of it. And that added together nicely as well. But I also did, again, what Landon did in his tutorial. I used another color corrector. I transformed it and I blurred it. And I transformed it again with the intention of making a very subtle reflection shockwave on the floor like this. The best way to add this reflection is by using an add mode as an apply mode. The thing is, Fusion doesn't have one, but luckily if you turn down the gain slider here, the alpha gain slider, it will have the same mathematical effect as an add mode. That's a very cool thing I learned at www.stakeonthewater.com. It is the Fusion community to be for cool things you don't find in online tutorials like this one, or the manual. If you're interested in learning Fusion, go there and you will find lots of helpful people hanging around there, well, like myself. This is without it, and this is with. It's a nice reflection filling in the image with more cool stuff. Let's take a look at how that part works for now. So there you have it. A nice explosion with lots of debris, lots of flashes, lots of glow. Looking pretty nice. And this is even without the color grade. But still, it could be even better. I mean, you can see the reflection down here. And yes, it does work like a bit of a shockwave. But again, the attention is in the detail, so we'll add a little more detail and it will be done in the form of dust waves. ActionVFX has a couple of nice dust elements as well. They are shot at a very high frame rate, and since this is a very volatile explosion, I use a time speed tool like this, set to a speed of 3, so that the cloud bellows into the frame more quickly. I use the same element with a slightly different delay, and this very cool element called Dust at Camera, which when sped up will fill the frame rather nicely at the end. Now of course, without the proper grading, this will not integrate too well in the scene, and since it doesn't come with an alpha channel, I use a luminance keyer to create one. But, and this is very important, by default the Luma keyer has the post multiply image button checked. Turn that off and you'll see that you get rid of the dark edges that are in there. After that you can use the brightness contrast tool or a color grader or whatever to change the appearance of your clouds. And since I didn't like the color, I used the channel boolean tool to combine this colored background with the alpha channel of the original, and then fed that in a matte control set to post multiply image. Here you can have that part checked, so you go from this to this, or in the context of the scene you go from this to this. This way it's nicely integrated into the whole shot. I repeated the same process with slightly different colors, a bit of this, and a bit of this, so that they all have a slightly different effect on the end result. This is with a single dust cloud, this is with the second, and then adding the third, and that all ties together the shot real nicely. And even when judged in the context of the violet, the composite still holds up pretty nicely. So, as far as I'm concerned, the whole compositing part of this tutorial is done. As you can tell, I've also added a camera shake tool here. And this camera shake will make the virtual camera shake a little. Well, by default it has a pretty big rotation deviation. Normally when you shoot something handheld, there's not much rotation. There's much more shaking than actual rotation from left to right. So I always dialed it down a lot. And then I animated the various settings to make sure that when the impact hits, we are shaken a lot. And as you can tell, I use the duplicate edges to make sure that we don't get any gaps. And then I use the transform tool to slightly enlarge the image during the camera shake. And to make sure that wasn't as noticeable, I started out from the start, zooming in ever so slightly while the actor is approaching the camera. Then the explosion hits. What's also important is to turn on the motion blur, because that will give this cool effect. And as soon as the effect of the camera shake dies down, I zoom out again. So you go from this to this with a slight zoom. I transform everything back into log space, because that works best with the LUT. I added a small color correct to lighten up the dark parts a little bit, because they get crushed in the LUT. So there you have it. We started out with this shot, then we added a very cool and exciting explosion. We added ground bursts in front and to the back of the explosion. We added some small debris and dust clouds and tied it all together with glows, blurs, masks, color grading and everything to get this very nice looking end result. Now only one question remains. What caused this explosion? Luckily I have an answer to that as well. I'm pretty sure it was an asteroid. And since we're working in Fusion, we're going to create an asteroid as well. I'm going to go through my Fusion comp one by one to show you how I went from the gas explosion from ActionVFX to an asteroid impact. Here we go. This is the shot we have so far. Nice impact at around frame 31 of the shot. So I need an asteroid to come into the frame and hit the ground at about frame 31. Okay, first things first. I need to match the asteroid to the movement of the shot. So I use a tracker to track this lamppost to follow the first 30 frames or something. With the tracking done, it was time to get started on the asteroid itself. I looked at my gas explosion. I cropped it a little because I don't need the whole explosion to be in frame all the time. I sped it up 2 times. I used the paint tool to get rid of this annoying little flame, because when you use this explosion as a particle, the flame really stands out. So I used the paint tool to get rid of that. Since the whole shot lasts about 100 frames, I need 100 frames of smoke. But at the end of the shot, it doesn't matter that it goes out of frame, because that's where the smoke goes anyway. I use the B-spline to follow along with the explosion, like so. So we get a nice clean cloud. I then use the transform tool to keep the explosion more or less in place, and when the smoke rises, I let it rise out of the frame. At this point in time, the size was too big to be used for particles, so I resized it back to 500 by 500. I use this brightness contrast tool to clip the black and the white, so that when I use a glow tool, I don't get illegal values that are super bright or super black, because they really mess up your glows. Near the end of the explosion, I find that the clouds become a little bit blurry from itself and I want to have a little more definition. So what I did was use a fast noise tool like so, and then combine the alpha channel from the original explosion with the fast noise foreground, and then I merge it on top of the explosion near the end. So you go from this to this, so it gets a little more definition near the end of the shot. With the basic look of the cloud finished, it's time to work on the actual particle. Like I said, I want the trajectory to be more or less from here to here. We start far off in the distance and then come closer. So what I did was animate the particle emitter so that it starts out very far away and comes closer very quickly, like so. I have a small variance in the numbers. I start out with lots of them and end up with less of them to make the end of the trail or the head of the trail to be more specific, more defined. I have a slight velocity to make it rise. I have a rotation variance of about 180 degrees so that the emitted particles don't all look exactly the same. I use a bitmap style like this with some animated variations. At the beginning of the shot I don't want the asteroid trail to fade in slowly, but if it's in the back that's not a problem. So I start with a small fade in, which I dial back, so this gets a nice well-defined look. And even when you go up all the way up to frame 70, there's still lots of detail in the smoke. At the point of impact it looks like this. I desaturate a little because when I add glows and stuff like that it will resaturate. I use the transform tool connected to the tracker I did before, so it will follow the motion of the shot, and it does, as you can tell. At the point of impact I want this to be slightly brighter, so I made a very bright version of it, which I blurred slightly and then merged on top of it, but I only want the head of the trail to be this bright, so I animated this ellipse mask to follow the trajectory of the incoming asteroid like this, so you get a nice flaming head of the trail. As you can tell, the edges are a bit harsh, so I used the filter tool to detect the edges. I blurred them a little bit and then made them extra hard again, resulting in a white mask that I can use to drive the vari blur, and the vari blur makes the whole thing integrate a little better. I use this dissolve tool to easily switch between the preview mode and the final render mode, and then I rendered out the elements as a TGA sequence, and then I imported it back in our original composition, resulting in this very cool end result. And there you have it, an asteroid coming in, blowing up stuff in a very cool way, all thanks to ActionVFX.com and Fusion. This was Sander de Recht. Thank you for watching, I hope it was useful to you, and I'm looking forward to all the things that you will create with the tools that ActionVFX and Fusion provide to you.